Section 30 of Crime as Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Harvey. Chapter 3. Penalties anthropologically adapted to the sex, age, etc. of the criminal and to the nature of the crime. Subchapter 219. Sex. As I have shown in Chapter 14, and in my Female Offender, we may conclude that the true-born criminal exists among women only in the form of the prostitute, who already finds in her lamentable calling a substitute for crime. Most female criminals are the only criminals from accident or passion, passing frequently from one to the other of these two classes. They very rarely show the type and tendencies of the criminal, and commit only from 11% to 20% as many crimes as men. They lead, it is true, in poisoning, abortion, and infanticide, but of the highway robberies, only 6% to 8% are committed by women. When we add that the crimes which are more essentially feminine, such as abortion and infanticide, are just those for which there is least need of punishment, being almost always committed at the suggestion of the lover or husband, it is often sufficient to separate the criminals. The penalty for the greater number of female criminals could be limited to a reprimand with a suspended sentence, except in the very rare cases of poisoning, swindling, or homicide, in which would be necessary to confine the offender in a convent, where, on account of the great susceptibility to suggestion, religion could be substituted for the eroticism that is the most frequent cause of their crimes. I have had proofs of this in a cellular prison under my charge, where, however, the nuns and attendants were not especially well fitted for their duties. As for those who relapse 2 or 3 times into sexual crimes, the only method would be to enroll them in the official list of prostitutes, which would have the advantage of preventing clandestine prostitution, much the most harmful sort. Recognizing the great importance which women attach to dress and ornament, we may often in minor offences, such as thefts, brawls, and slanders, replace a prison sentence by penalties which will touch female vanity, such as cutting the hair, etc. In adopting special penalties for women, we shall only be returning to usages of the ancients, the Jews and the Germans. In Russia in the Middle Ages, a woman who struck her husband had to ride upon an ass with her face toward the tail. In England, women who quarrelled among themselves had to go through the village with a weight chained to their foot. Slanderers and busybodies had to wear a muzzle. Conrad Keltz writes in his De Origine Situ Moribus et Institutionibus domain. Women who have been brought in disrepute because of witchcraft or superstitious practices, or have been guilty of infanticide or abortion, have various punishments inflicted upon them, being either sewed up in sacks and drowned, or even burned to death, or buried alive. Yet these cruel punishments are not sufficient to prevent their continually adding crime to crime. Subchapter 220. Abortion. The crimes of abortion which do not have professional gain for the object ought to be punished only by a reprimand or putting upon probation. It is to Balestrini that the credit is due for demonstrating that the procuring of an abortion ought not to be treated as a crime, for the lawmaker cannot in this matter pretend to be protecting the family, since this crime is most often committed by unmarried mothers just with the object of not creating an illegitimate family. Regarded as a defense of the person, such as law would have no force except where the abortion was procured without the consent of the mother. The abstract legal object is equally without standing, since society has nothing to gain from the birth of illegitimate children. The fiction of civil law which extends personally to unborn children cannot be characterized over into criminal law. The legal existence of the fetal life as a part of the social structure is, moreover, very contestable. An embryo does not represent a human being, but a being still at the stage of animalism, or rather a lower animal, which, in the earlier months, it would take an embryologist to recognize as human at all. No right is injured, then, by an abortion produced by a woman upon herself, not even by the danger which she incurs, no one being able to prevent another from injuring himself. We may add that indictments, and still more convictions, are very rare, and that there is a risk of an unjust conviction from the difficulty of obtaining certain proof except in very rare cases. In Italy in 1863, out of 9 women tried, 4 were acquitted. In 1870 there were 4 acquitted to 8 indictments, and in 1881 the same number to 13 indictments. In England from 1847 to 1849 there were only 3 cases of abortion tried. In 1850 there were 5, in 1851 4, in 1852 9, in 1853 17, out of which number there were 12 acquittals. In 1853 there was not a single trial for abortion in Scotland, and the same was true in Württemberg in 1853-54. And the rarity of convictions, 28%, not only casts ridicule upon the law, but also makes it appear that there is injustice in the rare cases where the penalty is exacted. Subchapter 221. Infanticide. All these arguments are applicable to infanticide also. Birth, the latter development of the embryo, is only an unjust cause of infamy to the woman without being any advantage to society, to which on the contrary it becomes a charge. For if the infant is abandoned, it is received into a foundling asylum, where it is legally assassinated, the mortality in these establishments being so great as to be like a permanent epidemic. Thus in Syracuse, the mortality of foundlings reaches 73%. At Modica, 99%, and at Turin, 50%. It may be objected that we ought not to interfere with the increase of the population, but in that case we ought to pass laws against onanism. All thinkers recognize that law is a relation of man to man, having for its object to make possible the existence of man in society, that it has 2 terms, man in society, but man only in so far as he is a member of society. In the case of the fetus, and in the case of the newly born child as well, we can recognize only one of these 2 terms fully. We may even say that the social element is completely lacking. It is evident in fact that both are rather under the guardianship of the mother, who constitutes their whole environment, than under that of society, of which they are still not directly a part. The alarm society for the life of an infant of whose existence is still ignorant. For infanticide, honorias causa, must necessarily take place before the birth of the infant is known, ought to be much less than that for the loss of an adult in the flower of his age. We must, then, deduct from the theoretical evil caused by the murder of the newborn child the amount of certain or probable evil which would come from the preservation of a life which exposes the father and mother to an irreparable loss of honour, compromises the peace of one family and sometimes of several, or, at least, in case the child is deserted, puts society in a perplexing situation. For on the one hand, the imperious voice of charity imposes upon society the necessity of receiving the innocent foundling, while on the other hand reason and experience teach that, by constantly accepting the bringing up of these children as an obligation, it incurs the risk of encouraging desertion and makes charity degenerate into a reward of immorality. As for the direct harm caused by infanticide, it consists in the suppression of an existence so threatened by the frequency of stillbirths and the great mortality of foundlings, that it does not all approach the harm done by an ordinary homicide. It is hardly necessary to add that a penitentiary sentence would have the infallible effect of depraving the woman, and of taking from her, together with a habit of housework, the means of rehabilitating herself when her term has expired. On the other hand, if we base the penalty upon the fear of a relapse, it can have no hold upon the infanticide, who is almost invariably a criminal by accident or by passion, rarely a recidivist. Probation with security for good behaviour is here, then, very generally sufficient. Limiting in this way the repressive measures against women, we shall prevent those decisions of judges and juries which seems so unjust when we compare the treatment of women with that of men. Out of 100 of each sex who came to trial at the Assize in Italy, 34 women and 31 men were acquitted, 31 women and 19 men before the tribunal, and 8 women and 6 men before the justices of the peace. In France, 25 women and 50 men were acquitted at the Assize, and in Russia, 31 women and 34 men. Subchapter 222. Age, Youth. Prison is still less the proper expedient for the youth of either sex. I have shown that there are offences which belong physiologically to childhood, such as cruelty to animals, theft of food, and cheating. What is really useful in these cases is what we may call moral nurture, putting them into the care of respectable and kindly families where the children will be well treated, and where they will be submitted to the proper sort of suggestion, so powerful at that age. Here they will be stimulated to continued activity for the satisfaction of their proper pride, and at the same time will be withdrawn from dissipation and idleness. Charitable institutions, agricultural colonies, and reform schools like Barnardo's, and that at Elmira, rendered more useful by the application of new ideas drawn from psychology and psychiatry and by immigration to agricultural centers, will prevent the occasional crime so frequent at that age, and will succeed in certain cases, if not in correcting, at least in usefully transforming the born criminal, and in any case will prevent him from contaminating others. For this purpose it is necessary to avoid the detention prison, which is the greatest source of corruption for youth. We speak, says Jolly, of the prisons of the Middle Ages, where they found a dead man between two sick men in the same bed. What we still do in our prisons is destined, I believe, to cause quite as much astonishment by and by. We put a person away in judgment who is innocent or perhaps only an occasional criminal in contact with the hardened offenders. France, with such promiscuities, transforms into malefactors children who have no tendency to crime. And all this has not even the advantage of making a selection, since, as Jolly very well observes, the children acquitted are worse than those convicted. It is for this reason that every violent correctional measure ought to be regarded as harmful, and we should turn to milder measures, especially remembering the great precocity of criminals. The limit of age at which we begin our application ought to be set at some little time before 9 years, and prolonged in the case of infantilism to a period considerably beyond that set by law. The limit should vary, also according to climate, race, profession, etc. The Semitic and Southern races are, for example, much more precocious in crimes of blood and in sexual crimes, and the poor and those who live in the country are slower to develop than the city dwellers and the rich. Subchapter 223. Old Age. The old man, unable to do harm, ought, like the child, to be spared the prison sentence. In his case, the common refuge, the workhouse, is sufficient. Here such inmates should be kept in separate apartments, with special precautions to prevent the contagion of evil and also escape. Only when the crime shows an unconquerable perversity should the old man be incarcerated in a regular prison. For the true criminals, by passion, remorse for crime is already the greatest of punishments. A fine, a judicial reprimand, or removal from the city or from the persons injured will be sufficient to protect society, to which they present no danger, and this treatment will leave them able to be useful because of the great altruism which is characteristic of their class. Subchapter 225. Political Criminals. Much the same way may be said of political criminals. If there is a crime which should be spared not only capital punishment, but even any severe punishment at all, it is that of the political criminal. This is especially true because many political criminals, if they are not criminals by passion, are insane and need the hospital more than the scaffold, and because even when they are criminals, their altruism renders them worthy of the greatest consideration, and often by having their altruism given another direction, they may be made useful to society. Louise Mitchell was called, in New Caledonia, the Red Angel, so devoted was she to the sick and unfortunate. Moreover, almost all political criminals are young, and it is in youth that heroism and fanaticism attain their highest degree. It is not possible to kill an idea by killing the man who has conceived it. On the contrary, it grows and perpetuates itself better in the glow of the matchless halo, all the more if it is true, while if it is false, it falls of itself. Furthermore, it is not possible to pass final judgment upon a man while he is alive, any more than a single generation can decide with certainty as to the falsity of an idea that has arisen under their own eyes. Russia has, for a long time, given us proofs of the uselessness of two severe laws against political criminals. Each of her terrible acts of repression by condemnation to a lingering death in the mines of Siberia has been followed by new and more violent reactions, and the same is true of France and Italy. Ravachol was not yet dead when he was turned into a demigod, and hymns were sung in Paris in his honour instead of the Marseillaise. There is nothing, writes one of our profoundest thinkers, G. Ferrero, more potent in exciting revolutionary tendencies than those legendary metrologies that stir the imagination of the numbers of fanatics with whom our society is swarming, and who are always an important element in all revolutionary movements. In every society there is a crowd of persons who need a martyr. They enjoy being persecuted and believing themselves the victims of human wickedness. They enroll themselves in the political parties which offer the most danger, just as certain mountain climbers choose the mountain that has the most dangerous precipices and the most inaccessible peaks. For all such, there is no more powerful incentive to embrace revolutionary theories than violent persecutions, and nothing is more dangerous than to give these exalted imaginations the corpse of an executed leader. That which characterizes these political criminals especially is a lack, which we might call specific, of adaptability to the form of government under which they are living. While born criminals show themselves unadaptable not only to the social environment of the nation in which they are found, but also to that of any nation of the same degree of civilization. For this reason, while born criminals must be eliminated from the civilized world, political criminals, who are such by passion, need simply be removed from the government and social environment by the people to whom they have proved unable to adapt themselves. Exile, as it existed in Roman law, and as it now exists in Abyssinia, and in serious cases, deportation, are then the penalties most appropriate for this class of criminals. But these penalties ought always to be temporary and revocable every 3 or 5 years at the will of Parliament, for before the expiration of the sentence, public opinion may very well have changed. It is just for this reason that our school, while opposed to jury trial for ordinary crimes, accepts it in the case of political crimes as the only means of diagnosis which permits the recognition of whether the public opinion regards the offence in question as a crime. It was thus that formerly heresy was punished as a grave as possible crime, while to punish it today would seem ridiculous. It will be the same in a short time with crimes of lèse-majesté, strikes, and the pretended offences of socialistic thought. By this means we shall prevent those rare cases of rebellion which are, as we have seen, the beginnings of evolution. And this idea is neither revolutionary nor new, for it has already been applied in different countries and epochs under really free governments. In Florence under the form of admonition, in Greece under that of ostracism, and in Sicily as petalism. In the Constitution of the United States, it is Congress itself which fixes the penalty for political crimes, and the same situation prevailed in the Roman Republic. But if the punishment for crimes provoked by political passion alone ought always to be temporary, in mixed political crimes, on the contrary, the penalty might be applied in a mixed form, that is to say, fixed for a certain term of years, corresponding to the legitimate social reaction, and indeterminate for another series of years, in order that it may be possible to interrupt it, if the attack upon the political organization is no longer considered in the country as a crime. Subchapter 226. Occasional Criminals. The same crime calls for a different penalty according as it is committed by a born criminal, a criminaloid, or an occasional criminal, and even at times in this latter case for no punishment at all. In this case it is essential to recognize the true motive. An offence that is really occasional and which excludes the thought of punishment is a theft of food by persons who are famished. Real punishment is equally inappropriate in all cases of involuntary offences, according to their opinion of Puglia, Pincero, and Capobianco. The amount of the damages to be paid left to the civil judges, for it would be unjust to regard a man as absolutely unfit to live in society, simply for the reason that through negligence or thoughtlessness, or by a pure accident which could not be repeated, he has committed a harmful act. If the same thing occurs repeatedly, it is possible that the simple dangers, a fine, a suspension from the office, act, or profession which have been the cause of the blamable act. Subchapter 227. Aid to Suicide. Among the pretended crimes which the law punishes but which the public conscience absolves are those which Garofalo calls not natural but juridical, and which we shall call conventional. Aid to suicide is an example. If, leaving aside pure abstractions, we interrogate the science of life, we shall see, write Calusi and Ferri, that the interest of society in the existence of each of its members is not absolute, but that it decreases greatly, even ceases altogether in the case of voluntary death. On its side, biology shows us that in the struggle for existence it is the weakest, those least adapted to the social life, who succumb. Suicide is one of the forms of this defeat. It is, according to Haeckel, a safety valve for future generations to whom it spares a fatal heritage of nervous diseases with their consequent misery. It is, says Bergot, one of the instruments for the amelioration of the human race by the road of selection. Such is also the opinion of more steadily, and of myself. I've shown with Ferry that suicide is opposed to homicide, that is, a real safety valve, so that where one increases, the other decreases. On this side, then, suicide is a real advantage to the security of the state. Either, continues Ferry, you maintain that a man has not a right to dispose of his own life, and then you ought to punish the suicide, or else you recognize that suicide is not a crime, in that how can you punish the man who takes part in the suicide by aiding in it, just for taking part in what is no crime? For even if we cannot deny that the state exercises its repressive function for the purpose of defending its citizens as individuals in the case of crime against their safety, who does not see that real and voluntary consent of the victim removes any excuse for interference on the part of the state? Wherein do we feel our safety threatened when we learn that an individual has been killed at his own request? The Church alone can pretend to save the sinner in spite of himself. Subchapter 228, Defamation. The same may be said of the penalties decreed by the Italian Code against defamation having a political or social object. The work most often of men better than the normal, who have the courage to reveal to the public facts that pass for defamation only because the persons accused are powerful. These noble defamers are not to be feared, and they do no damage. They disobey the law only because it is imperfect. They are, then, pseudo-criminals, more worthy of praise and punishment. It is enough to make them show their good faith by furnishing proof of the facts or by retracting if they are deceived, especially since to lay bare our wounds is to begin their cure. Subchapter 229. The Duel. The situation is much the same with regard to the duel. Are we still subject to the tyranny of the custom which drove us to the duel in grave and exceptional cases when the services of the law became unavailing? If it is so, then we have before us, in persons guilty of dueling, harmless individuals. We should be using an excess and unjust zeal if we were to punish them in order to escape a danger which in reality does not exist. On the other hand, is it the office of the criminal law to correct morals? Assuredly not, for morals and laws follow the natural trend of things, and are both determined by environment. It is enough to recall that duels raged most in the countries where they were punished most severely, and that from the Middle Ages to our own time the number has decreased in measure as the laws against them became milder. But whoever believed that prejudices could be overcome by penalties? Have not the prejudices already gathered enough victims without having these useless punishments coming in and demanding new ones? The penal code ought to aim at defending society by purifying it from the evil race of criminals. Now the duellist, at least in most cases, is rather a victim than a criminal. And if, on account of the means which science offers us, we are able to identify him as a criminal in those rare cases in which he is such, why should we offer him this honourable means of escape? If he is not a criminal, why should we punish him for being the victim of the very prejudices which we wish to eradicate? But the prejudice will either die, or it will be stronger than the law, and the penalties which, on account of their severity, will not be applied, will render the important efforts of the lawmaker all the more ridiculous. Subchapter 230. Adultery. In the matter of adultery again, the situation is much the same. That it should be punished as a crime in the canon law is doubtless justified, but in the modern code it can be classed at most only as a contravention. Adultery is assuredly immoral, and it is certain that if a law could prevent it by punishment it would be welcome, but that it could do so is not the opinion of the majority. Moreover, in this kind of trial, the victim suffers more than the culprit. It is useless, then, to have recourse in the law, and besides, the general and habitual impunity renders condemnation, in the rare cases where it takes place, all the more cruel. As Berardini rightly says in his magnificent monograph, Offesa e Divisa, the law cannot oblige a woman to love her husband or the husband his wife. It can only safeguard rights that may be exacted materially and by force. Love is not a right that either one of a married couple can require of the other, and the law cannot, in consequence, protect a right which does not exist for the person who claims to have been injured. Adultery, by dissolving their natural marriage, involves a moral divorce. Why should not also dissolve the civil marriage by a legal divorce? Why maintain forcibly the cause of the disturbance, while aggravating its effects by the useless scandal of a trial and a condemnation? Subchapter 231. Criminaloids. For criminaloids who are not recidivists and are without accomplices, it would be sufficient for the first time to suspend sentence, take security, and require the repayment of the damage by work where the culprit is not able to pay. This work should be in the fields where the offender is a peasant, or in the case of refusal to work, in a cellular prison. Subchapter 232. Homosexual offenders. Homosexual offenders whose crime has been occasioned by a residence in barracks, or colleagues, or by a forced celibacy, plainly will not relapse when the cause has been removed. It will be sufficient in their case to inflict a conditional punishment, for they are not to be confused with the homosexual offenders who are born such, and who manifest their evil propensities from childhood without being determined by special causes. These should be confined from their youth, for they are a source of contagion and cause a great number of occasional criminals. Subchapter 233. Other minor offences. Many other punishable acts could be transferred from the penal to the civil code for fines and payment of damages. In this class come the violation of private correspondence, damages caused by the property of another, and bad treatment of other members of the family who are not habitual or proceeding from depraved and truly criminal instincts. To this treatment we may add, in the case of husband and wife, separation and divorce. These disciplinary measures will be sufficient in the case of a violation of the duties proper to a public employee, and could be carried to the extent of dismissing him from his position. Simple threats, violation of domicile without criminal intent, insult, arbitrary taking of satisfaction, abuse of pastorage rights, and trespass will be sufficiently punished by payment of damages, which could very well be estimated by a civil judge. I would add to the list thefts of food of small value, provided that the small value of the article stolen showed the occasional character of the offence. It is not a fragrant injustice that petty thieves, or most often quite inoffensive children who have stolen fruit, for example, shall be punished as severely as real criminals who steal upon a large scale, or even more severely, since the latter often escape punishment altogether. I shall never forget how upon the day when 5 ministers of the realm of Italy rose as one man in open parliament to deny or to justify the thefts of Tanlogo and Company, running up to more than 30 millions. 7 children were sent to sweep for a month and a half in prison cells for having stolen a herring of the value of 35 centesimi. In the last case, I should wish to make a distinction between the really criminal gang having a common understanding and a minutely detailed plan, and that accidental semi-complicity which often has nothing criminal in it, being the effect of a simple caprice. The former I would punish very severely, while the latter a simple reparation to the person injured with a reprimand or a conditional sentence would suffice. Subchapter 234. Complicity. The least dangerous criminals, those who are occasional criminals or criminals of passion, having for their psychological characteristic always to act alone without accomplices, it follows that complicity, at least in thefts, highway robberies, and murders, in the case of adults, must constitute by itself an aggravated circumstance, and every case should not be looked into, as it is now, merely to determine what share in the guilt each member of the band had, but should be taken as a distinctive mark of criminals belonging to the most dangerous classes. Subchapter 235. Habitual criminals. As the recidivists and criminaloids who have become habitual criminals, they should be treated like born criminals but subjected to a less severe discipline. Their crimes being almost always less serious: theft, swindling, forgery, etc. Further, while in the case of the born criminal the first crime is serious, it is sufficient to have him sentenced to perpetual confinement. In the case of the habitual criminal, it is necessary, before determining upon this extreme treatment, to have the evidence of a number of recidivisms more or less great according to the kind of crimes and the circumstances under which they were committed. For the employment of these criminals there should be larger workshops, for those who come from the cities and for those who come from the country, agricultural colonies and districts that need clearing, graded from the least to the most healthful according to the different categories of criminals. The colony of Castidas, which has created an oasis in the most insalubrious districts of Sardinia, and the miracles of the Trois Fontaines, prove how easy it is to put these organizations to practical use, diminishing the enormous expenses which respectable people have to pay for the punishment of criminals, and at the same time making them of real service to the society which they have injured. Subchapter 236. The Criminal Insane. As for the criminal insane and the numerous born criminals in whom epilepsy and moral insanity manifest themselves clearly by fits of mental disturbance, the only proper treatment is confinement in a criminal asylum. By means of such an institution, we take away from the criminal who might feign insanity or desire to do so. We prevent a criminal heredity derived from the inmates. We put an end to their forming criminal associations, the criminal bands having almost all a prison origin. We prevent recidivism and cut down the enormous expenses of trials and the imitative crimes which often result from trials. Weidmeister objects that these asylums will do an injury to justice in case the patient becomes cured. In reply, we will remark in the first place that these cases are quite rare. The statistics of Broadmoor record about 5.5%. However this may be, the inconvenience may be remedied by granting liberty to those patients only who have shown themselves to be cured during a long period of observation. But as soon as a criminal has been recognized as insane, objects Falbet, he is not to be considered as a criminal, but resumes his status under the civil law. To this we reply that he cannot return to that status, because he has killed, ravished and stolen, and cannot therefore be put on the same plane as the harmless insane, for as long as the danger persists, the right of defence remains. Aside from this method of reasoning is derived from a class of ideas which science will from now on eliminate. This is to say that while insanity is a misfortune, crime is a perversity of the free will. Now, just as men came to recognize a century ago, contrary to the beliefs of the Middle Ages, that insanity did not depend upon free will, we must now recognize that neither does crime itself depend upon it. Crime and insanity are both misfortunes. Let us treat them, then, without rancor, but defend ourselves from their blows. On the principle of the positive school, the objection cannot be maintained that the insane, so-called criminal comes under the civil law simply. He comes under the law of self-defense as much as the true criminal. For this reason the objection falls that the insane person cannot be detained for an indeterminate time, and that when he is cured, even before the expiration of the term which he would have passed in prison, in case of conviction, he has the right to go free. This objection cannot be admitted, considering the great number of relapses which have been shown to occur in all forms of insanity. There are misfortunes that are inexorable and grant only a short respite. Since we cannot deliver the individual from them completely, let us try at least to prevent the family of the hapless wretch, and society in general, from being victims. Furthermore, all the civilized nations show similar institutions. We have seen that in England they are already ancient. The criminal asylum exists also in Denmark, and has been introduced into Sweden and Hungary. In France, at the Prefecture of Police, there is a permanent medical commission whose duty it is to separate immediately from the other persons arrested those who appear to be insane. In 1870, a real asylum for the criminal insane was erected as a part of the central institution at Gallion. This department is kept under the discipline of the prison except as to the compulsory labour, and also as to the punishments, which can be inflicted only with the permission of physicians. Only those who have been sentenced to imprisonment for more than 1 year are admitted here, and they cannot be discharged without the authorization of the minister. All the other civilized peoples of continental Europe, if they have not regular criminal asylums, have laws and institutions which partly take the place of them. At Hamburg, Halle, and Bruchsal, the penitentiaries have infirmaries which are reserved exclusively for the insane, with guidance, secure cells, and a special discipline so that the insane can receive a continual care there, as in the regular asylums. In Belgium, a law 1850 decrees that persons arrested, proceedings against whom have been suspended, for the cause of insanity, shall be consigned to asylums designed by the public minister. These asylums must have special wards for maniacal prisoners, accused or convicted, who cannot be mingled with the other patients, without special authorization from the Minister of Justice. The physician in charge is responsible for the escape of dangerous or criminal insane persons, and in case of flight, must take all the necessary steps to recover them. A new law, La Loi Lejeune, 1891, requires the appointment of 3 alienists as special inspectors of prison to discover, isolate and care for the insane. In Hungary, a kind of medical senate composed of judges and physicians who are alienists is charged with pronouncing upon doubtful cases. We may say then, in summing up, that in these asylums there should be received, first, all prisoners who have become insane, if they have criminal tendencies; second, all the insane who, on account of homicidal or incendiary tendencies, pedestry, etc., have been subjected to a judicial procedure which has been suspended upon the delivery of their insanity; third, all those charged with strange or atrocious crimes committed without clear motive, in whose case has arisen the suspicion of insanity, or at least of a serious cerebral affection, is attested by 3 expert alienists. Fourth, in consideration of the extraordinary importance of epilepsy, all those who have committed crimes in a state of psychotic epilepsy, and criminals who have had epileptic fits. Fifth, all those who, being of general good reputation, are driven to crime by an habitual and evident infirmity, such as pellagra, chronic alcoholism, and perpetual diseases, especially where they have insane or epileptic parents, or show numerous marks of degeneracy. In this connection we see the property of having special criminal asylums for the alcoholic, epileptic, etc. The insane coming from the prisons must be isolated from the others and placed in separate wards in the infirmaries and next to the prison. The discipline should be severe for all, and the vigilance greater than in the common asylums, more like that of the prisons, but the work should be proportioned to the strength and alternated with long periods of rest and amusement. The direction should be medical, but the attendants should have prison training. Individuals who are recognized as habitually dangerous and have already been several times arranged ought never to be liberated. Those who are affected with a transitory or intermittent form of insanity and show signs of a perfect cure should be selected for discharge after 1 or 2 years of observation, and subjected after their release to monthly medical visits for several years, as is done in Belgium. Subchapter 237. Incorrigible Criminals. We have seen that the best penitentiary system will not prevent recidivism, and that the individualized system has given unfortunate results in Denmark. On the other hand, we have seen that we have in the collective prisons the most frequent cause of repeated recidivisms and criminal actions. Further, what can one hope for the individuals, like those described by Brenton and Asperel, return to prison 50 or 60 times in a single year? Such persons evidently find themselves better off there than outside, so that for them prison is no longer a punishment, but a reward and an encouragement to corruption. When no method is of service any longer, when the criminal is insensible to all the pains taken with him and relapses 10 or 20 times, society ought not to wait while he perfects himself in crime by a new sojourn in prison, but should keep him shut up until assured of his reformation, or better, of his powerlessness to do harm. We should, for this end, establish special penal institutions to which a jury composed of directors, physicians, and judges shall consign all the individuals who, having from infancy shown an inclination towards crime, have relapsed several times, especially if they present those physical and psychical characteristics which have seen to be masks of the born criminal. Even more important than the well-being of the inmate is a matter of making them useful, that they may not occasion too great an expense, and also the matter of preventing the possibility of escape. For this reason, islands or retired valleys are the best locations. Here the prisoners may be occupied, if they come from the country, in work in the fields, which will be useful for their health and of advantage to the state, while those who come from the city may be provided for in workshops. Better still, disciplined military companies might be formed, as the practice in Westphalia, and put to work to improve the roads and drain the marshes. They should be permitted daily to spend some hours according to their own taste, but they should be set at liberty again only after extraordinary proof of reformation. The cellular system should be inflicted upon them in the case of a new relapse. In this way the prison would become purged of those criminals who take pride in vice and render all attempts at reform there impossible. In this way we shall apply anew to society the process of selection to which is due the existence of our race, and also probably the existence of justice itself, since it was the elimination of the more violent that gradually allowed justice to prevail. However high the expense of all this may be, it will always be less than the cost of new crimes and new trials. Thompson calculates that 458 Scotch recidivists cost £132,000, of which £86,000 was for the cost of the trial alone. This proposition is not new, for in 1864 the House of Lords proposed to condemn criminals to penal servitude after a second recidivism. A Libist proposes that after the expiration of his sentence, every individual whose total sentences exceed 5 years, and who has relapsed for the 10th time, shall be permanently deported. The same reform is proposed by Bonneville, Tissot, and Doria Barini, and has already been put into operation in Belgium in the agricultural colony of Max-Place, which contains 4,500 individuals. The buildings of the institution were all erected by the labour of the convicts themselves under the superintendence of 30 or 44 men. Everything was constructed little by little according to the needs and resources, so that this magnificent establishment, which in other countries would have cost millions, has cost Belgium only the price of the land. Livestock multiplies upon the place, since the farms have their own bulls and stallions. The workmen are occupied only with the production of such things as have an easy sale, and the making of which they may be useful. The inmates are divided into 4 classes. First, those who are refractory or dangerous, contact with whom might be harmful to the other inmates. Second, recidivist convicts, under the surveillance of the police, those who have formerly escaped, and those who have had a bad record in the institution itself. Third, men whose antecedents have something to be desired, but have never had to undergo severe punishment in the institution. Fourth, those who have not been deported to the colonies more than 3 times, whose conduct might be considered as good. The communions sometimes send their paupers there, paying 65 centimes for those who are well and 85 for the sick. Those who refuse to work are kept in a cell 3 days upon bread and water. The inmates are paid for their labour in a currency which passes only the institution, but is exchanged for real money when they are discharged. In this way the danger of spending money in the neighbouring hamlets is avoided. Subchapter 238. The Death Penalty. But when, in spite of the prison, transportation and hard labour, these criminals repeat their sanguinary crimes and threaten the lives of honest men for the 3rd or 4th time, there is nothing left but the last selection, painful but sure, capital punishment. Just as the death penalty is too largely inscribed in the book of nature, so it is in the book of history, and like all other punishments, it has a relative justice. Capital punishment assuredly ought to be found in the penal system of barbarous peoples, among whom prison does not inspire sufficient terror, but among civilized people, the delicacy of feeling which wishes to abolish it is too respectable to be brushed aside, to say nothing of the fact that the singular prestige produced by a death inflicted in cold blood by judges, and at times met with bravado, often multiplies crimes by imitation and creates among the rabble a sort of worship of the unfortunate victim. But the opponents of this form of punishment do not think of asking, what means of defence is left to society against a man guilty of repeated murders who keeps his guards in constant danger of violation or death? Would it be more just or more humane to keep him bound hand and foot for life? Let no one advance the objection, with Ferry, that in order to make capital punishment effective, it must become a regular butchery, a thing repugnant to modern thought. To retain the death penalty is not the same as multiplying it. It is enough that it should remain suspended like the sword of Damocles over the head of the more terrible criminals, when after having been condemned to imprisonment for life, they have several times made attempts upon the lives of others. Under these conditions, there is no longer any weight to the otherwise fundamentally sound objection which is so often put forward, namely, that this penalty is irreparable. I should also wish to have this punishment retained when the social system of a country is menaced by associated crime under the forms of brigandage, the Camorra, etc. From this point of view, it seems to me that the civil conditions are absolutely equivalent to the conditions for which this penalty is reserved in time of war. What? Shall we be unmoved when by the right of conscription we condemn in advance thousands of men to an early death upon the battlefield, often for dynastic caprice or demagogic madness? And shall we hesitate when it is a question of suppressing some few criminal individuals 100 times more dangerous and fatal than a foreign enemy, in whose ranks a chance bullet may strike a Darwin or a Gladstone? Assuredly, if we take the point of view of strict abstract right, we do not believe ourselves to be God's vicars, and therefore have no absolute right over the life of our fellows. But unless this right comes to us with necessity of self-defence, neither have we any right to deprive men of liberty or to hold them accountable for the least misdemeanour. To claim that the death penalty is contrary to the laws of nature is to ignore the fact that this law is written in the book of nature in letters only too clear, and that the very progress of the organic world is entirely based upon the struggle for existence, followed by savage hecatombs. The fact that there exist such beings as born criminals, organically fitted for evil, atavistic reproductions, not simply of savage men, but even of the fiercest animals, far from making us more compassionate towards them, as has been maintained, steels us against all pity. A love for animals, except among the fakirs of India, has not reached such a point that we are willing to sacrifice our own lives for their benefit. Here I can but recall the vigorous lines which Taine wrote to me shortly before he died. When in the life of the intellectual, moral, and emotional organization of the criminal impulse is isolated, accidental, and transitory, we can and even ought to pardon, but the more the impulse is bound up with the entire fabric of the ideas and feelings, the more guilty is the man, and the more ought he to be punished. You have shown us fierce and lubricious orangutans with human faces. It is evident that as such they cannot act otherwise. If they ravish, steal, and kill, it is by virtue of their own nature and their past, but there is all the more reason for destroying them when it has been proved they will always remain orangutans. As far as they are concerned, I have no objection to the death penalty if society is likely to profit by it. Many of the measures which I have advocated may be contrary to certain ideal principles, which, while more noble than practical, are regarded by short-sighted intolerance as unassailable axioms. Further, they may be regarded by those who are frightened at the first cost as difficult to put into practice, but this is to lose sight of the economies which they would make possible in the future, especially if we should suppress, at least for recidivists, the costly and useless judicial proceedings based solely upon errors in form. In any case, they cannot be accused of endangering the public safety, which is the ultimate aim of all penal systems. End of section 30. Section 31 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 4. Practical Proofs of the Utility of These Reforms. England, Switzerland. Subchapter 239. The utility of these reforms is proved by the recent statistics of London and Geneva, where there has been a perceptible decrease in criminality, while on the contrary, crime is increasing in countries like Italy and Spain, where such reforms have not been applied. In the period between 1829 and 1838, there were recorded at Geneva, for each 100,000 inhabitants, 79 criminals convicted by the criminal court and 1,000 by the correctional tribunal, while between 1872 and 1885, there were recorded 12 of the former and 300 of the latter. This is to say, between the two periods, the serious crimes decreased by 5/6 and the minor offences by 2/3. This is certainly a great honour to the city, and the facts are even stronger, for the crimes committed by the Genevese themselves had decreased nearly 9/10 in the last 80 years. What are the causes that make Geneva an oasis of morality in the midst of Europe? Guinand attributes it in the first place to the fact that foreigners who have been for some time residents in Geneva have taken up the customs and morals of the natives. And the observation of Joly is to the same effect, namely that the immigrants at first contribute largely to the criminality, but as they become established in their new country, they gain in morality and honesty. But Ledin urges by way of objection, the assimilation of foreigners to the natives does not prevent immigration. The same causes consequently continue to be active, and if on one side of the population of Geneva annually assimilates a certain number of foreigners, the resultant moral influence is neutralized by new immigrants whose influence is the other way. Nor can we look for the cause in education, since we have seen that this very often increases at least the minor forms of criminality. The sole reason remaining is, then, that Geneva, see Part 2, Chapter 6, is certainly that place in Central Europe where there have been established the greatest number of institutions for mutual aid, which, without degrading the recipient's remedy, the greatest evils of poverty, and also preventive institutions for children, for degraded women, against alcoholism, etc. The proof of this conclusion appears more clearly still in England, especially in London, if we compare the criminality there in the years 1892 to 93 with those of the 10 years preceding. We find an increase of 28% in the offences against persons and 18.9% in those against property, caused by a desire for vengeance and taking the form of arson or the destroying of crops. But in other crimes, theft, receiving stolen goods, forgery, offences against the public order, etc., the decrease was respectively 8.8%, 36.3%, 34%, and 22.2%, with a total absolute decrease of 8%. Now it must be noted that in these 10 years the population increased 12%, so that even if there had been as much as an absolute increase of 12% in the criminality, it would mean that relatively to the population, crime was not on the increase in England. The degree there in the criminality of minors, which in Italy continues to increase, is still more remarkable. In 1868-69, there was recorded the conviction of 10,000 children less than 16 years of age. In the succeeding years, the figures fell to 9,700 and finally to 4,000. Thus we find that, taking account of the increase in population, England recorded in 1868, 69 and 70 46 juvenile criminals to the 100,000 inhabitants. In 1893, there were only 14, a real decrease of 70%, while it appears that in France in 1889, the number of juvenile offenders had increased 140% in 50 years. Criminal classes of England are composed of individuals at liberty, known to be thieves or receivers of stolen goods, and of persons under suspicion. Here also there is an improvement. In 1867, this last category comprised, taking prisoners and those at liberty together, 87,000 individuals. This figure fell later to 50,000, in 1881 to 38,960, and finally in 1891, 992 to 29,826. The suspected houses fell from 2,688 to 2,360. We do not have here those accidental variations in figures common in statistics, for they show such a decided difference that no doubt can remain. They extend even to unpublished crime. This great decrease in criminality is actually due to preventive measures, especially those which have to do with children, and to the moral and religious fight against alcoholism. We find an incontestable proof of this in the great diminution of crime in London, as compared with the smaller cities and with the country. This is exactly the opposite of what is observed elsewhere, since the general rule is a greater criminality of the principal cities. And while the city of London, which has the largest population of any city in the civilized world, records 15 suspected persons to 100,000 inhabitants, the country shows 61 and the other cities 50. Further, while London has 3.4 suspected houses to each 100,000 inhabitants, the country has 3.9 and the other cities 8.4. We have another proof of the influence of preventive measures in the diminution of alcoholism which has taken place in just those districts of England and Switzerland where the religious and purely ethical societies vie with the state in striking at the evil at its very source. While in France the sale of alcoholic drinks increased from 365,995 in 1869 to 417,518 in 1893, and from 1.82 litres to each inhabitant in 1830 to 4.2 in 1893. In England, on the contrary, the consumption per capita has fallen in recent years from 7 litres to 5, and in Switzerland from 11 litres to 7. Subchapter 240. Born Criminals. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that the measures which have been shown to be effective with other criminals could be successfully applied to born criminals, for these are, for the most part, refractory to all treatment, even the most affectionate care being at the very cradle, as Bernardo finally became convinced, such as Jack, whom he placed in conditions best fitted to reform him, but who escaped repeatedly to live a life of vagabondage. While the less advanced peoples are lingering over the utopias of the old jurists and believing that reform is possible for all criminals, are taking no measures against the continually rising tide of crime. The English, more provident, have recognized that although they have been able, by their efforts, to eliminate the accidental criminal almost entirely, the born criminal still persists. They are the only nation to admit the existence of criminals who resist or cure, the professional criminals, as they call them, and the criminal classes. It will not be useless for the benefit of those who limit the causes of crime to education and environment, To verify this with figures, while crime in England has decreased by 8%, recidivism among male criminals has remained stationary or nearly so. The English statistics, in fact, show 41.7% of recidivism in 1892-93 and 45% in 1894-95. In the case of women, recidivism has increased from 54.6% to 60.4%, and this notwithstanding the fact that the preventive institutions for women in London are much more numerous than those for men. But all efforts break down against the corruption encouraged by prostitution and against the increasing alcoholism of women. No one ever knew of a man, says Paolucci, who has reached 500 convictions for drunkenness, like Tessie J, or even 250, like Jane Cakebread. We have seen in this connection how the introduction of agricultural colonies has lessened theft and vagabondage in Westphalia. We must say, however, that this system can be of use only for occasional criminals, or for vagrants who are such from lack of work, while it is of no value for born vagabonds. We have a proof of this in an experiment which we tried in Paris. According to the economist Francis, 1893, a certain person arranged to obtain positions in stores, factories, etc. at 4 francs a day for all persons presenting a letter from himself. In 8 months, he offered this letter to 727 beggars who complained that they were starving because of lack of work. More than half, 415 of these, did not even call for the letter. 130 got the letter but had not presented it to any employer. Others worked for half a day, drew their 2 francs and did not return. In short, out of the whole 727, only 8 continued at work. Taking simply those who took the letter, we see that out of every 40 beggars able to work, only 1 has a sincere desire to do so. Even if the young people whom Bernardo sent to Canada were reformed, out of those who immigrated to the same country from the reform school at Redhill, 42% returned worse than before, notwithstanding the £1,000 spent for the Reformation. Jolly. End of section 31. Section 32 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Harvey. Chapter 5. Practical Application to the Criticism of Criminal Law, to Expert Testimony, Pedagogy, Art and Science. Subchapter 241. All these facts prove abundantly that criminal anthropology not only solves the theoretical problems of law, but suggests useful lessons in the struggle of society against crime. While ancient penal science, the more it rose into the exalted regions of jurisprudence, the more it lost touch with practice and less it knew how to protect us. Subchapter 242. Political Crime. One of the newest and at the same time most practical applications of criminal anthropology is that which takes into account the fact that men's hatred of the new is the juridical basis of political crime. From the study of the physiognomy and biology of the political criminal, it establishes a difference between a real revolution, a useful and productive thing, and mere revolts, which are always sterile and harmful. It is a fact now definitely recognized, and one of which I have given proofs in my Crime Politique, that those who start great scientific and political revolutions are almost always young, endowed with genius or with a singular altruism, and of fine physiognomy, and far from presenting the insensibility common in born criminals. They are, on the contrary, marked by a real moral and physical hyperesthesia. But if from the materials of a great social and religious idea we pass to rebels, regicides, and presidenticides, such as Fouché and Guiteau, to the promoters of the massacres of 1793, such as Carrier, Jordan, and Marat, and to the anarchists, we see that all, or nearly all, are of a criminal type. These are rebels. Subchapter 243. Application to Psychiatric Expert Testimony. Medical experts and practical penologists who have studied criminal anthropology have become convinced of the value of this science in recognizing the real culprit and deciding how far an accomplice has participated in a crime. Hitherto these things have had to be determined from unreliable indications, such as prison confessions and vague official information. I will cite as proof of this the following examples. 1. Berson Pierre, 37 years of age, was known as a thief, had been arrested under charge of having stolen 20,000 francs upon the railroad. In prison he feigned madness, pretended that someone had poisoned him. It was soon plain that he had committed many other thefts, since he was found in possession of a number of documents and passports, among others that of a certain Torelli. The result of an anthropological examination was as follows. Mean cranial capacity 1589 cc. Cephalic index 77. Type of physiognomy completely criminal. Touch nearly normal. Tongue 1.9 mm, between points perceived separately. Right hand 2 3, left hand 1 2. The sensorial masculinism. General sensibility and sensibility to pain very obtuse. 48 mm and 10 mm respectively on the adjustable Ruhmkorff coil, as against 61 mm and 24 mm for the normal man. An investigation with a hydrophysmograph confirmed me in my observation of his great insensibility to pain, which had not changed the physiognomatic lines. The same apathy persisted when he was spoken to at the robbery on the railroad. While there was an enormous depression, a fall of 14 mm, when the Torelli theft was mentioned, I concluded, therefore, that he had had no part in the railway robbery, but that he had certainly participated in the Torelli affair, and my conclusions were completely verified. 2. Maria Gall, of Lucera, 66 years of age, was found dead in her bed, her face to the mattress, and her nostrils bloody, bruised and lacerated inside. Suspicion at once directed itself against her two stepsons, M and F, men of bad reputation who had been seen roaming in the neighbourhood during the day and alone had an interest in the death of the victim, since she was about to purchase a life annuity which would have disinherited them. At the autopsy there was shown to be all the internal marks of advanced putrefaction and asphyxiation, and in the esophagus was found an intestinal worm resting upon the opening of the glottis. 2 experts pronounced it to be the case of asphyxia, produced by violent suffocation through the victim's being held with her face against the bolster, the worm having been drawn there only through a fit of coughing. Another expert admitted the asphyxia, but was not willing to deny the possibility of it having been caused by the worm. Called in my turn, as a consulting expert, I was able at least to observe that death from asphyxia produced by intestinal worms are found only in infants and insane persons, and that then marked phenomena of reaction appear, which in this case were completely wanting. Further, that the witness, C, declared that he had heard stifled cries and the sound of blows on the night of the crime in the direction of the chamber of the victim, and especially that M, the accused person, was judicially and anthropologically suspected of the crime, which he had been openly accused by his brother, who, much less criminal than he, was less obstinate in his denials. M was in fact the most perfect type of the born criminal. Enormous jaws, frontal sinuses and zygomata, thin upper lip, huge incisors, unusually large head 1620 cc, tactile obtuseness 4 mm right, 2 mm left, with sensorial mansinism. He was convicted. 3. A rich farmer, S, returning from market with 2,000 francs about him, was asked by an unknown man seeking work to take him into the carriage with him. From then on, this person did not leave him. They supped together and were seen towards evening going along the high road, where the following night the unfortunate farmer was found assassinated, bearing the marks of strangulation, his head shattered with great stones and his purse empty. 4 witnesses called the judge's attention to the sinister physiognomy of the unknown man, and a young girl declared that she had seen, in the evening, sleeping near the murdered man, a certain Vazio, who was observed the next day hiding himself when the gendarmes approached the neighbourhood. Upon examination, I found that this man had outstanding ears, great maxillaries and cheekbones, lemurine appendix, division of the frontal bone, premature wrinkles, sinister look, nose twisted to the right, in short, a physiognomy approaching the criminal type. Pupils very slightly mobile, reflexes the tendon quicker on the right side than on the left, great tactile obtuseness, more on the right hand, 5mm, than on the left, 4mm. Motor and sensorial Mansonism. Large picture of a woman tattooed upon his breast with the words, "Remembrance of Selina Lura," his wife, and on his arm the picture of a girl. He had an epileptic aunt and an insane cousin, and an investigation showed that he was a gambler and idler. In every way, then, biology furnished in this case indications which, joined with the other evidence, would have been enough to convict him in a country less tender toward criminals. Notwithstanding, he was acquitted. Subchapter 244. Proof of Innocence. Criminal anthropology can not only help us to discover the real culprits, but may also serve, or at least rehabilitate, innocent persons accused or convicted. Such a case occurred where a little girl, 3.5 years old, was violated and affected by an unknown man, and her mother accused successively 6 young men who lived on the same staircase and were familiar with the child. They were arrested, but all denied the crime. I picked out immediately one among them who had obscene tattooing upon his arm, a sinister physiognomy, irregularities on the field of vision, and also traces of a recent attack of syphilis. Later the individual confessed his crime. A case observed in my clinic and published by Rossi in Una Centuria di Criminali revealed the innocence of a convict, a certain Rossotto Giancito, as a consequence of a series of false declarations and a letter received from his brother-in-law begging him to give false testimony, was condemned to imprisonment for life for highway robbery. Examining this man before my students, I found to my great surprise that this was the most normal individual I had ever investigated. He was 50 years old, his height was 1.73 meters, he weighed 74.5 kilograms, his hair and beard were abundant, mean cranial capacity 1575 cc, cephalic index 84, and he was without facial anomaly. His sense of touch was very fine, 1.1 millimeters for the right hand, 1.0 for the left, and 0.5 for the tongue. His general sensibility was normal, 50, and sensibility to pain, 30. He was ignorant of thieves' slang and was not cynical. He showed the condition of mind common to the average man. He was fond of work, which had been his only consolation during the long years of his captivity. His conduct had always been exemplary. Even in prison he had shown no vexation except at his unjust condemnation and his separation from his family. Married at 19 years, he had never had intercourse with any other woman than his wife, and his family included neither insane persons nor criminals. While I was examining him, not yet knowing anything of his antecedents, I said to my students, if this man had not been sentenced for life, he would represent to me the true type of the average honest man. It was then that the unfortunate man quietly answered, "But I am an honest man, and I can prove it." He put in my possession numerous documents proving his perfect honesty, such as deathbed declarations of the real authors of the crime with which he had been charged. He swore before the justice of the peace they had no part in the crime, attestations of prison directors, etc. His neighbours, of whom I made inquiries with regard to him, declared that he was a perfectly honest man. Subchapter 245. Pedagogy. 2 hours school is owing still another application, yet to no less useful, namely the application of pedagogy, anthropological examination by pointing out the criminal type, the precocious development of the body, the lack of symmetry, the smallness of the head, and the exaggerated size of the face explains the scholastic and disciplinary shortcomings of children thus marked and permits them to be separated in time from their better endowed companions and directed towards careers more suited to their temperament. And sometimes it may even point the way to a cure, through immigration, moral education, and medical treatment. Subchapter 246. Art, Letters. In literature itself, we can see a last application of this new science, not only in the interpretation of masterpieces in which genius has already anticipated some of the results of criminal anthropology, as Shakespeare in Macbeth and Lear and Wirtz in Anthropologically, but also in suggesting new forms of art, as in the admirable works of Dostoevsky, Tottenhaus, and Schuldenschön, in Zola's Betumain, Garbarg's Kolbrot Tenebro, og Andre Skildringer, Ibsen's Hedda Gabler, and Das Nudios Innocente. And why should we not count among our triumphs the new applications that have been made to the most distant branches of science? Thus Max Nordau has found in our science a basis for the criticism of artistic, philosophical, and literary creations. In the same way, Ferry and Lefort have made an application of it to the criticism of the great masters of painting and the drama, and now Segel, Ferrero, and Bianchi have applied it to modern history and politics. When a collective crime rises suddenly as a strange, inexplicable phenomenon in modern society, the researchers into the special crime of mobs explain it for us admirably. At the same time, they teach us to defend ourselves against such crimes as the preventive measures counselled by philanthropy. Otherwise, a cruel reaction would certainly follow with universal approval, and the wound would be poisoned instead of healed. End of section 32. Section 33 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 6. The Utilization of Crime. Symbiosis. Subchapter 247. Having arrived at the end of my long labour, like the traveller who finally touches the shore, I cast a glance over the space that I have traversed, and among numerous omissions, of which there is no lack in the most carefully executed work, I perceive that I have too much neglected that side of crime which concerns its utility, proved at least indirectly by its long continuance. If we try to apply the Darwinian law, according to which only those organisms survive which have utility for the species, to the fact that crime does not cease to increase, the least number of forms of swindling, peculation, and bankruptcy, we're driven to believe that it must have, if not a function, at least a social utility. It is known, in fact, that in ancient times, and still today among the less civilized peoples, the greatest crimes were, and still are, utilized as a political weapon. We even possess a code, that of Machiavelli, which is only a long series of criminal projects with a political end, in which Borgia was the model. Do we not see, from the time of the Council of Ten in Venice, who hired assassins for political purposes, to the massacre of St. Bartholomew, crime reigning as sovereign in the most remote as well as the most recent epochs? No one has forgotten the parliamentary corruption of Pitt and Guizot, or the treasons of Fouché and Talleyrand. More recently, the Panamists and the Crispists have shown us that political morality differs widely from private morality, and that ministers may be criminals even though highly esteemed, while the anarchists, in their turn, have declared that they regard crime as a weapon of war. The man of integrity, moreover, whose love of justice and truth prevents his telling a lie necessary to surmount an obstacle, to lure distrusted persons, or to flatter princes with whom flattery is the highest virtue, will always find insurmountable difficulties barring his way. We see then that vice becomes almost necessary for parliamentary government of uncivilized and civilized peoples alike. Buckle has shown in his immortal work how much more dangerous it is to have statesmen ignorant than to have them criminal. For if they are ignorant, they leave the nation exposed to all the rascals there are, while if they are rascals themselves, they alone commit crime. It was the worst minister that Italy has had who declared, "We shall be incapable but honest." Yet history has shown that not even he was honest. In our time, the lie is no less necessary to specialists, physicians, and lawyers. It is even the basis of their operations. The pious lie which comforts the last moments of the consumptive is often used not simply for the hysterical and choleric, but even for those who were perfectly well, just as the defense of the orphan and the widow is easily used also on behalf of their persecutors. Further, is there any greater crime than war, which is only an accumulation of theft, arson, rape, and murder, provoked by causes similar to those of common crimes, such as personal ambition and cupidity, and excused only because they are committed on a large scale? However, we must recognize that if war is an evil in civilized countries, is in semi-barbarous countries the starting point for immense progress. Beginning with the primitive tribe, men are welded by war into small groups, then to larger groups, and finally into nations. Furthermore, military conquest has obliged savage men, who are naturally idle, to endure privations and to overcome the natural disinclination to work. It has initiated the system of gradual subordination under which all social life has been established. Spencer. War, on the other hand, has often contributed popular liberty. It is doubtless for this reason that the indignation against war is not sufficiently general to prevent men from provoking it. Prostitution, which we have seen to be the equivalent of crime, can in its turn prevent a number of sexual crimes, as is proved by the relatively greater number of rapes in country districts. We know that the creation of houses of prostitution brought sullen internal gratitude, when it was recognized how useful they were for checking the increasing number of rapes at Athens. Usury itself was not without utility. It was from this that the bourgeoisie arose, with the first accumulations of capital capable of giving birth to the most potent enterprises of humanity. Novikov has shown us that the expulsion of the Jewish merchants and usurers from Russia impoverished the very peasants on whose behalf it was carried out, for it had on its result the lowering of the price of flax, for want of the speculators to sell the product. We know also that the officials of the communes in the Middle Ages, after having expelled the Jews, soon had to recall them because their expulsion had paralyzed all the industries. I have shown that many of the penalties against crimes in barbarous times were themselves only new crimes, such as codified vengeance, cannibalism, etc. The taboo was a series of prohibitions, often absurd, introduced by the priests nearly always for their own self-interest. There are found among these some which are useful, such as those which protect the crops and the fisheries from exhaustion by a premature gathering. Compensation for homicide, which barbarous chiefs imposed upon their subjects and bishops and popes, continued during the Middle Ages, was nothing else than simony and peculation under different forms. But it was a check upon homicide, and fixed the principle of a less barbarous codification having a principle of gradation. I believe, then, that the modern tolerance towards so many criminals is due to the tendency to a love of the new which they very often bring into the industries and even into politics, a tendency totally opposed to the temper of the average man. In the writings of criminals, among innumerable things that are shameful, I have at times observed traces of a genius which is not met with in the average man. In criminals, as in men of genius, with whom they have in common an elliptoid basis, degeneracy is not productive of evil alone. Just as in the man of genius the excess of intelligence is compensated by a lack of moral sense and practical energy, so in the criminal the lack of feeling is often compensated for by energy of action and a love of the new, the organic anomaly destroying the exaggerated conservatism habitual to the normal man. Their anomality, their love of the new, impelled them to enroll themselves into the extreme parties. Caesar and Catiline at first found partisans only among rascals, while the ancient concert party drew only respectable persons. History teaches us that the nucleus of small and great rebellions is criminal. Moreover, criminals play such a part in parliamentary life that it would be impossible to eliminate them from it without great harm, just as it would not have been possible to expel the ancient tyrants who were criminals by useful criminals. Even forgers and swindlers, though they work entirely for their own advantage, set in motion so many different activities that they give a powerful impulse to progress. Their lack of scruples, their violent impulsiveness, and their blindness to obstacles cause them to succeed where honest men would inevitably fail. This fondness for innovations which they carry out by crime is at times a starting point for immense enterprises. The construction of the Suez Canal, for example, is due to a colossal swindle accomplished by the same artificers which were employed in connection with Panama. Similarly, the English Navy had its origin in the piracy of Drake and his contemporaries. The colonization of Venezuela by the Italians is due to an officer expelled from our army for cheating. Maimande mentions 2 swindlers, an incendiary, and 2 thieves who introduced into New Caledonia the cultivation of tapioca and potatoes on a large scale, and also the tanning of leather, while another thief, following a distiller, discovered the means of extracting perfumes and liquors from the indigenous plants. Among semi-barbarous nations, where crime is rather a common activity than a misdeed, the criminals often become popular justices and, as it were, political tribunes. They exercise and put in practice for their own benefit, it is true, but also for the benefit of others, a kind of violent communism, which permits them to enrich themselves while despoiling the rich and powerful, but they apply at the same time a summary justice which supplies a lack of official justice. In Sardinia, in Corsica, and for a long time in Sicily under the Bourbons, the real judges, the true protectors of the oppressed were, and still actually are, the brigands, who often divide their booty with the poor, becoming their leaders in revolts. In Naples, and in Sicily in part, the Camorra and the Mafia, although they are criminal associations, for a long time administered a relative justice upon the people, expectedly in the haunts of vice, in the inns and in the prisons. They were able to offer property owners and travellers a kind of security against malefactors, which it was far from being in the power of the government to guarantee. It was for this reason that they were tolerated and even aided by honest men. Thus was it under Louis XIV, during nearly a century, the poorer people of France owed to brigands and smugglers, associated and organized almost into an army, the fact that they were able to harvest salt, which was then so heavily taxed that it had become an article of real luxury. In the midst of too corrupt a civilization, when the extreme of legalism has come to encourage crime by impunity, lynching, which is itself a crime, becomes a barbarous but efficacious means of self-defense. In California, for example, all the public offices, including the judgeships, were in the hands of a band of real malefactors who stole with impunity and were acquitted when accused. The majority of the people, becoming disgusted, rose up and lynched them. Since then, California has become the quietest state in the Union. Without this means justice would never have been succeeded in extirpating the criminals, any more than now in Italy it succeeds in reaching great rascals if they are under the shelter of their high offices. All this explains why, among barbarous peoples, as among the most civilized, many crimes are not only not punished, but are even encouraged, and why the reaction against certain crimes is so weak and insufficient. Besides, the objections, revisions, appeals, and counter-appeals for the purpose of securing the impartiality of the verdict are so numerous that, when sentence is finally pronounced, men have forgotten the crime, or they are so wearied by waiting that the most unjust verdict awakens no opposition. And if sometimes the judgment is unjust and severe, pardons and amnesties remedy the matter, so that a crime must be very poor and very stupid if he is to undergo the whole of the punishment that he deserves. Criminal trials too frequently serve only to allow lawyers to transfer to their own pockets the money which criminals have stolen from honest men. Such trials are, after all, only a pretext for us to lull ourselves into a feeling of security which new crimes daily prove false. We may add that if the ancient criminal trials, judicial cannibalism, the public copulation of persons guilty of adultery, and the combats with wild beasts were wretched and criminal amusements, modern trials, in their turn, are no less immoral, thanks to the theatrical character of the assizes and of the infliction of the death penalty. At these the worst criminals congregate, finding them their best amusements, as well as a means of learning more evil and increasing the number of their misdeeds. It results that the penalty itself and the means of executing it are another form of crime, of which the whole cost is borne by honest men. Thus Italy, having lost 20 millions by the evil devices of criminals, loses 4 times as much in having them arrested and tried, and 6 times as much for their support in prison. It is not too much to say that a good share of honest men's earnings are paid out for the benefit of criminals, for whom an ill-conceived pity always finds extenuating circumstances, and the more so the worse they are. All this would not have persisted through so many centuries if the fundamental usefulness of certain crimes among barbarous or semi-barbarous peoples had not been great enough to prevent a really decided reaction from arising in the hearts of honest men. Subchapter 248 Symbiosis. By this temporary function of crime being omitted, does it follow that the supreme end to which this book is directed, the contest against crime, is useless and perhaps even harmful? If it were so, I myself, in whom desire for the good and hatred of evil surpass any theoretical conviction, would be the first to tear up these pages. But happily we can, even at present, already catch a glimpse of a less discouraging way, which, without abolishing the struggle against crime, will admit of less harsh means of repression. The new way which is open before us is only in part pointed out by our pitiless criticism of present penal methods and our praise of preventive measures as the most direct and effective helps against crime. The new method requires, as one of the principal measures, the creation of institutions for utilizing the criminal in the same degree as the honest man, to the great advantage of both, and this so much the more since very often crime, for example the crime of anarchy, reveals the most infected seat of the social diseases, just as cholera points out the quarters of the city that most requires sanitation. We aim at this end in proportion as we lay aside the ancient repressive cruelty, in accordance with the change in the times and the amelioration of social conditions. If it is true that crimes are increasing in number, it is also true that they have been stripped of their ancient atavistic ferocity and clothed in new, less repugnant and less savage forms, like forgery and swindling, against which culture and foresight are a better safeguard than repression. As the times change, we see how social inequalities become less and less, and just as our most urgent social needs have been met by collective means in public lighting, education, and road making, so now we begin to see that similar means will repair our greatest social injustices, and that in this way one of the most powerful causes of accidental crime, the insufficiency of work, may be eliminated and the excess of wealth, another potent cause of crime, prevented. There exists, it is true, a group of criminals born for evil, against whom all social cures break as against a rock, a fact which compels us to eliminate them completely, even by death. But we comprehend that this deplorable necessity will end by disappearing, at least for the less dangerous criminals, the criminaloids, and that the means of adapting them to social life will become more and more frequent, thanks to medical cure and to their utilization occupations suited to their atavistic tendencies. Such would be war or surgery for homicides, the police or journalism for swindlers, etc., and finally colonization of wild and unhealthy countries for vagabonds, where they would be at least subjected to a fixed abode. If on the one hand, natural history has shown us the existence of murderous organs even in plants, carnivorous plants, it shows us also, almost as a symbol of human charity, numerous cases of symbiosis, i.e., instances where plants, harmful in themselves, become useful and beneficial when united together, while increasing their own vigor. Thus, the richness of nitrogen in leguminous plants is due to the schizomazet, the Rhizobium liguminosarum of Frank, which collects in the roots of these plants and penetrates by their rootlets into the earth, into their very cells, where it multiplies. The cells, in turn, being irritated, divide, giving rise to another tubercle, where the germ is formed, part of which is utilized by the plant, and other part spreads in the soil, increasing its richness in nitrogen. In the animal world, we see the Medusa Combessa palmaps, which attacks everything that approaches it, defending the Caranx melampigus against the large fishes, and the same way the hermit crab, in place of devouring the actinia, allows it to fasten itself upon its shell, and, while carrying and protecting it, makes use of its brilliant colour to attract its own prey. If science has shown us that the fusion of two useless or harmful plants may be useful, as when the fungi and the algae together produce the lichens, the time is not far distant when society will find the means, with an appropriate symbiotic culture, to accumulate the criminaloid to the environment of the most fully developed citizens, not only tolerating him but also utilizing him to its own advantage. The time is doubtless not far distant when we shall see in human civilization the carnivorous plants being eliminated, while the symbiotic plants go on increasing. But we shall attain this end completely only upon the basis of the new science of anthropology, which by individualizing its work can give us powerful aid in discovering the special tendencies of criminals in order to direct them to utilize the less antisocial of them. Nino Bixio is a striking example of the possibility of this reform. Criminal and impulsive from childhood, he was the terror of his companions, whom he struck on all occasions. A vagabond and deserter, he seemed entirely incorrigible, yet he became a famous man when he was brought into the Navy, where he could expend his excess of activity. In the same way, men are not rare whom Garibaldi transformed from vagabonds into heroes. Very often in prisons, I have heard thieves and assassins declare that they had committed their crimes only in order to get the means to become comedians or bicyclists, protesting, with that accent that does not admit of doubt, that if they had been able to attain their ideal, they would have become famous and forever escaped from crime. I am the more convinced that they were right, since I have observed born criminals occupying high positions in the world who satisfied their evil propensities in the exercise of their profession, becoming very often, instead of the antisocial beings they once were, useful members of society. There is a certain celebrated surgeon who presents upon his face, the skull, and even in his talk, all the marks of congenital criminality, of which he has also the etiology. He has found an outlet for his cruel energy in surgical operations, which, while doubtless sometimes dangerous, have nevertheless always the signs of genius. I have also noticed certain Trinis, an athletic workman, who was well behaved as long as he could spend his energy upon his work, but became dangerous as soon as sickness kept him idle. This is the type of the murderer from superabundance of force, which he discharges against someone else, especially against the police. I have known another criminal, analgesic and afflicted with vertigo from birth, who remained honest as long as he could satisfy his fondness for the sight of blood in his trade of butcher. When he became a corporal, however, he beat the soldiers to whom he had to teach the manual of arms. Out of work he became a swindler, thief and murderer. Talou, the Sardinian brigand, many times a murderer, was in the last years of his life very useful for the public safety in Sardinia against certain bands organized to steal cattle, whom he kept in order by the terror of his name alone, while soldiers and gendarmes could do nothing against them. Tiburcio did the same for more than a quarter of a century in the Roman Campagna, and prevented all thefts by other criminals, but Talou did still more, for he introduced the prevention of crime by having cattle lent to those who would otherwise have had to steal them, and persuade the people that honest labour pays better than theft. I have shown in my previous studies that genius, like moral insanity, has its basis in epilepsy. It is not absurd, then, to see moral insanity united with genius, and by that very union made not only harmless but sometimes even useful to society. This occurs in the case of great conquerors and leaders of revolutions, so that the criminal marks escape notice, even with contemporaries, although they may be even more striking than the marks of genius. When we study the lives of the great pioneers in Australia and America, we see that they were almost all born criminals, pirates, or assassins, whose excessive fondness for action, strife, carnage, and novelty, which would have been an immense danger for their country, found a useful outlet in the midst of tribes of savages. All this proves that we must profit by the change which epileptic insanity sometimes brings on, impelling born criminals to excessive altruism and even saintliness, which, in its turn, draws along not only individuals but whole masses in an epidemic of virtue. Such were the cases of Lazaretti, of Loyola, and of St. John of Ciudad. Their insensibility to pain and their recklessness make heroes of them in the face of danger, as we have seen in the case of Helen, Fersici, and Montini, who had gained medals for valor in war, and the Cliftes, who were the first heroes of the Greek War of Independence. Many are criminals from that impulsiveness which drives them as irresistibly towards good as toward evil. It is thus that we may explain the heroism of the convicts at the time of the cholera at Naples and Palermo, and the similar heroism which saved the whole village of Kotscha from burning. It is for this reason that the state, instead of using repressive measures, ought to attempt to direct to great altruistic works that energy, that passion for the good, the just, and the new, which animates the criminal by passion in the political criminal. A great people ought to aim at the utilization of these forces, which, left to themselves, would certainly become dangerous, for they can be utilized, and may even succeed in transforming the apathetic masses. Revolutions are the result of energies entirely polarized toward the new and the useful, but often the immaturity of the innovations which they set themselves to introduce makes them, for the time being, unsuitable and dangerous. It follows then that the punishment of the authors, if it is all possible to punish them, ought not to be made painful, and if it is necessary to prevent the new movement from starting prematurely, it is not necessary to prevent it from taking a direction which might be advantageous at a more propitious time. If the ball which struck Garibaldi had killed him, many great works would never have seen the day, and if death had not so soon snatched him from us, who knows whether he would not have realized his dream of turning the marshes of Italy into fertile fields, in place of our throwing ourselves headlong into the barren moors of Africa. In a nation like Russia, exhausted by an all-powerful bureaucracy, we have seen the energy of persecuted sectaries transformed almost uninhabitable regions into fruitful fields with prosperous and populous cities. Here are the results of symbiosis. This is the sublime goal which the great Redeemer and the prophet foresaw when they prophesied. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the bullock. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, saith the Lord. And it is what Madame de Staël, that saint of a newer time, divined when she declared, "To understand is to pardon." End of section 33. And end of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. Translated by Henry P. Horton. Recorded by Leon Harvey.